Well, welcome everyone. My name is Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center for the webinar Introduction to Reflective Writing. So a couple preliminaries. If you're new to the Writing Center and haven't used our services before, we do have many different free services for students. We never charge you for any services, as some universities do. I'm happy to say that ACU, it's all included in the tuition. So you can visit us up to 2 times a week normally. We do grant third appointments depending on whether we have the staff available and if other people have had a chance to sign up. So if you are asking in 5 weeks in advance, probably won't give you a third week then. But if it's the next day and you say, I spent some time revising my paper and I would really like to have this free slot that's open, sure, we're happy to help out as we're able, as capacity permits. We are available for both real-time, meaning phone or Zoom appointments, just like you're seeing my screen here today, and also for asynchronous appointments where you upload your paper and we send you feedback within 24 hours. It's often much less than that. Yesterday, I sent feedback to someone 30 minutes after they uploaded their paper. But I do want to remind you, if you're new to the Writing Center, that you want to both upload your paper to turn it in and actually make an appointment so that we know that you want feedback. Some people will also use our Turnitin service just to check for plagiarism to make sure that they've marked all their quotes and not accidentally left quotation marks out. And that's fine. Because of that, we won't look at your paper unless you make an appointment with us. And there's a video here on this slide that walks you through all those steps. If you're looking for examples of some of the types of writing that we're showing today, that link at the bottom of the slide will take you to the Online Writing Center website, which does have a growing body of examples. This is more on what we were talking about earlier. You'll see today that I have a much larger number of slides than we will be talking through in detail. And the intent there is that you will be able to follow up and, if you choose, to explore this in more detail, walk through the exercise, and see various supplements and other resources. I will not be passing through everything with the same level of detail as a result, but if there's something that you'd like me to repeat or go into more detail or explain, please, I encourage you to type your questions in the chat room as we go along. I might not answer your question immediately, but I will make sure to get to it. So our main learning objectives here are to break down some of the components of reflective writing, to understand its purpose, how it fits in the strong, well-organized writing process, talk a little bit about paragraph development and how to create a nice, clear, strong topic sentence, and about global cohesion and coherence. This isn't global in the sense of worldwide, but in the sense of taking all the different parts of your work and making them work together as something that speaks consistently, that creates a larger argument, and that basically will have your reader nodding as they read your paper. Oh, yes, okay, that makes sense. Okay, yeah, got that. All right, sure, there's evidence supporting that. So that by the time they get to the end, they say, okay, well, I agree. That's a good argument for that. Whether or not they agree with your larger point is not the same thing as, do they agree that it's well argued and supported? Because there are lots of things, just think of politics, where you might see a well-reasoned argument, but not be convinced for other reasons. And in many of these assignments, your purpose is not to convince the reader, but to present a strong argument so they understand, oh, this is a well-organized, researched, etc. argument for that. Now, a reflection paper is combining three major elements. There's the I, that personal experience. There's the text that is being used or sometimes created. And there's the larger world. And often where people go wrong in writing the reflection paper is that they focus too much on one of these and not on where these elements overlap. The graphic you have in front of you right now is what's called a Venn diagram, where we have intersecting circles. And where you really want to be is where all three circles intersect that dark, roughly triangle shaped area in the middle, because that's where the I is relevant to the world and the text. And if you focus on that, you're actually able to make a more compact paper to make your argument in fewer words and clearer because of that. Another way to think about reflective thinking is using this downward focused triangle, where we start with the broad. Okay, so how do all these large things, like how do we justify our actions? How do we solve problems, seek deeper meaning, suggest change? How do these ultimately lead to an understanding of you and what you have done, what you are doing, what you will doing? And the ways that you get to that on the way, where you create this clear conception of you, is by doing things like examining your assumptions, your beliefs, revisiting experiences through the lens of, oh, those were my assumptions, this is what I now do, and other things like that. Reflective thinking is usually a something that can incorporate critical thinking, but there's a different intent. Uh, if you could type in the chat window what program you're in, for example, counseling, EDD, DNP, that will help me customize some of these examples as we go. But for example, if you're in any sort of counseling program, whether it's clinical psychology or marriage counseling or something like that, you will have assignments where your goal is to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of yourself. And that's more reflective thinking. Critical thinking would be more like you are analyzing your clients or you're analyzing this case study and saying, okay, here's what to do there. But to really give good advice, you need a balance of that where you're able to understand how your own experience relates to the professional activities that you'll be doing. I see that someone's in the organizational leadership. Empathy is a huge part of leadership. You know, if someone comes to you with a complaint, they don't want to feel like you are brushing them off or that you don't care. And a lot of that inspiring people is giving people things where they say, ah, I see part of me reflected in what you are telling me, whether that's your own story or someone else's. And that resonance, that reflection are things that if you understand yourself, you can understand better how you relate with the rest of the world. So let's talk about what that means in practice. How can we make that more specific? Well, one of the goals is to connect ideas from your readings to your life. If you see something and to you it has the ring of truth because you see, oh, in my life, something just like that happened, or this makes more sense when I do that. We also want to connect ideas from the reading to your own identity. And for example, if you say, oh, well, in my professional capacity doing this, this is something that I feel I should be paying attention to because I see it can be important in these ways. Great. I want to use these course readings to analyze both yourself and the larger world. So not just critically analyzing someone else, but reflecting on your own. And there are a couple assignments in counseling and EDD that will ask you to do both in different parts of the paper. To use the theories and concepts as lens to reinterpret things in your past, and with the ultimate with the ultimate goal of creating personal and professional growth and a new informed perspective. Now, I know that many of our students have been doing what they've been doing for a significant body of time. I was talking with a counseling student the other day who's been doing this for 20 years, but they're moving to a new state and they need to credential up for that. And so what are the things that they need to do is not just say, I'm done, I'm ready, I'm doing this, but here's what I understand, here's how I have been doing that, where this perspective that I have is not something that I always had, but that I developed over time. So no matter what stage you are, uh, we want you to be able to reflect on what you have done before and how you have evolved. So what are some other things that you would do in reflective writing? Well, often we're exploring something and we are using it as a mechanism for us to discuss something else or as a starting point for that. Alternately, you can approach it as starting with, okay, the subject is important, which leads me to talk about myself. You'll see a lot of references in these slides to the Siegel Handbook, which is a wonderful writing resource. Whether you get it from the library or whether you own a copy, it's a great one to refer to, and a lot of our Writing Center materials will point you towards more detailed examples and exercises there. So here's an excerpt that talks about how to organize a reflective essay. And I'll be looking at a particular one in the program if we have enough time. But you'll see that this breaks down two different flows related to the previous slide. The one is, okay, start by describing the subject or an anecdote that gets us into talking about the subject, and then give us questions, observations that you made about it, examples of other things that hint at the larger problem. So we have this discussion. Usually it's not a discussion where you're having to come up with all those prompts by yourself. Usually the assignment and description and the assignment rubric will point these out to you. The chart at the bottom, the one that starts with introduce your subject, is something that starts with a more direct way of writing. And at this point, I'm going to say a little bit about APA style. What often confuses new graduate students or new graduate students writing in APA is not recognizing how the style informs the way of writing. In APA style, which emphasizes directness and conciseness and clarity, you always want your reader to know how things connect. So it's not that you can't write a reflection. And it's not that you can't start out with saying, all right, here are the things I'm going to do in the paper. But your reader shouldn't be confused about what you're doing and why. So long as you keep that in mind, you can start your paper many different ways. But whichever one, we're going to have some sort of introduction where you say, all right, this is what I'm discussing, or this is the argument that I'm making, or this is the issue that I'm addressing. That's going to be in our introduction. Some things will need more background than others. Some will need less, but you usually need at least a little background just to establish the context and say that this isn't something that happened, freak weather event. No, it's some issue that has a longer term or larger importance. You will also want to get away any discussions that, or definitions perhaps, that would clutter up the rest of the explanation. Give the reader everything they know so that they can focus on the argument and evidence that you cover in the next couple paragraphs. This particular order here ends with the thesis. You can also start with the thesis and then give supporting points. But you want your thesis statement to either be the beginning or the end of a paragraph, the first sentence or the last sentence, because that tells the reader by where it's placed, oh, this is something important that's either framing the discussion of the rest of the paragraph or encapsulating the discussion of the paragraph that you've just written. And then after we go through all the argument in the body, a question of what to put in your conclusion. I see a lot of papers from people early in the program who basically just give a summary. And that's fine for some types of writing. But for most of the assignments that you'll have, it will be better to give that summary of key points and then use that as the springboard into the discussion of, and how is this important to whom? Or to put it another way, okay, why is this important and what does it all mean when we put this together? So if you think of it rather than just a conclusion as a recap and conclusion, the recap is where you say, oh, here's what I told you, here are the main things. And now that I've reminded you of that, let's talk about how this is important, who cares about it, etc. So as far as the larger writing process goes, we might break it down into these 6 steps. The pre-writing is when you're collecting information You look at the assignment, what do they want you to do? You do the reading, you take notes on things you might write about. And then we move to outlining, where you draft a plan for writing the paper, ideally incorporating elements like questions from the assignment description so that you are covering all the key points that the instructor wants you to do and that your instructor is grading you on having done. The next part, drafting, this is something that some people do all in one go, but if you have a detailed outline, you can start working on filling in the details as you go. You might go back to the reading and put in different points, write your topic sentences, and then come back with different pieces of evidence from the reading, so on and so forth. There should, of course, be revision through whatever elements that you're checking. Revision is a step that's very easy to skip, which is in a reflective paper, usually something that means that you end up making explicit connections between the things that you were reflecting on and the purpose or goal of the larger assignment. Let's put it another way. If you start writing your paper early on, new class week starts on Tuesday. If you start reading the assignments and starting at least to draft your outline on Tuesday, then you'll be well prepped to have a working draft by Thursday or Friday that you could submit to the Writing Center and then get some feedback on, and really spend the last day or two on polishing your paper to make sure that it very clearly says and does all the things that your instructor wants it to. If you're rushing writing this at the last minute, you usually miss making those explicit connections because in your head, you know how things connect together, but your reader doesn't necessarily know how we go from point A to point B. And of course, please do remember to run a spelling and grammar check. It's something where these days it could be the key was stuck on the keyboard. You might have used voice to text for something and grabbed the wrong word. Or it might just be you were writing late at night and left a couple things out. But a spelling and grammar check is an easy way to help catch some of those things. You can also use resources like Grammarly to help with that. It's another set of eyes. Like any tool, it's not perfect, but it can be a very helpful part of your writing and revision process to use Grammarly, spelling and grammar checks, and the Writing Center, or something like tutor.com that we have institutional membership. Now, if you have a library book, please don't do this to it. If it's your own copy, feel free to annotate. I personally like to go ahead and print out things. Yeah, I can annotate in a PDF, but for me personally, I remember better when I underline and I highlight and when I write things into the margins. So I'll print out my course readings and then mark them up. I can, especially if I read the assignment instructions first, I can be marking things that I see, oh, I might use this, or this looks like it will be important when I'm coming back to that. So color coding can be really helpful to be able to come back to and say, oh, all these red things are super important to me. Right, so this next bit has some direct suggestions here, but I thought it would be helpful to give you those slides while looking at a particular assignment with this in mind. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to change my sharing so that I am looking at my web browser. Now, this doesn't always go smoothly immediately, so I want to check in with you folks and ask you to type in the chat room, can you see the CONR 602 website being shared with you now? Great, thank you. So this is one of those early classes in the sequence. And you'll see we have, oh, there's a link to the Graduate Writing Center website. Here's something for making a paper review appointment for our schedule. So that all that stuff is built into all of your classes. But right now, we are going to go ahead and go to assignments here. and we'll see that we have, aha, a reflection paper due around Labor Day. So let's look at this assignment here. So we have a detailed list of prompts, and you'll recognize that some of these are in some of the slides later on. But we have basically a roadmap of things we were supposed to cover in this paper. The introduction, tell the reader what this paper is about. What you don't want to say is just a sentence like, this is a reflection paper, period, and move on. That's not really helpful. That's redundant. We get that from the title of the assignment and reflection paper. Now, if you expand that with more particular details, then you can answer that question and have a fine introduction. So let's look at the next set of bullets and come back to that. Reflect on your personal definition of conflict, addressing the following. What is the chief cause of conflict? Is it positive or negative? How do you think people of faith should view this? Give supporting evidence. And what do you hope to learn about conflict in this course? Now, if we now look at the introduction with the idea that answering one or more of these questions is going to be a large part, probably the major thing that you're doing throughout this paper, now we can go back to the introduction and write something like a statement. I believe that X is Y. I believe that conflict is a terrible thing that is caused by people believing that everyone else understands the world the way that they do. Now that sentence, if I opened with that in my introduction, there's a lot there to unpack. And that's a good thing, because that's the kind of one sentence start that your reader says, I want to know what your reasons are behind that. And that's great, because then in the rest of your introduction paragraph, you lay out, okay, here are the key points. And then in your follow-up paragraphs, you expand on that. So I'm going to put the microphone down for a moment, and I'm going to open up a copy of our APA course paper template. If you don't know about our APA course paper template, please let me know in the chat window, and I can go ahead and include a copy of that or a link to download that in the chat room and attach it. So if you're not familiar with our APA course paper template, let me know and we'll make sure to get you a copy. So I'm just going to set that up now. Let's see. If you could let me know that you can see my sharing this, I'd appreciate it. Should be seeing just a Microsoft Word course paper with placeholders like full title of your paper here. Great. So when you get the template, do make sure to fill these things in. You'd be surprised how many people turn in a paper without their name in it. The title does not need to be fancy, especially for something like this, where it's early in the program. Later on, you'll have more elaborate and detailed titles, but reflection paper is just fine for what we're doing. All right, so filling in those placeholders there. All right, so you can download this from the Writing Center website. I will make sure to post that link later on, but for now, I'm going to go ahead and show you how I'm going to start using that rubric to craft my outline. So I'm in the background, I'm going and I'm just selecting all the assignment instructions that aren't, detailed video links or something like that. I'm just pasting this in here. Now, something you'll notice here is that the font is different. So if you go up to the menu and you select Edit, Paste and Match Formatting, then that'll be in the right font and the right font size immediately. Okay, I see more than one person has mentioned wanting a copy of the template, so I'm going to go ahead and get you that link now. Just a moment. All right, so I'm going to share a couple things with you. First of all, here is a link to our APA page that has a lot of related resources. Now, our APA course paper template is linked on the first line on that page. I'll go ahead and share that so you can see it. So I've opened up that link I gave you, and you'll see right here we have a video and a link to download a copy of the template. And you do want to download it to your computer and work on it in Microsoft Word. All right, back to the document. So I have pasted in here the instructions and say, okay, all right, I don't need this. I know I'm writing a reflection paper. Introduction, what will the reader find in your paper? So I want to cover that while also answering some of this. So let's see, what did I say earlier? I believe, it's I believe because we're reflecting on my thoughts here, that conflict is a terrible thing that results from people assuming that others see the world identically. There we are. So I can go ahead and follow that with more detailed examples. I think that since it says personal definition of conflict, let's start out with, I specifically define conflict as and then I see, oh, well, I can take this out now, and then I will answer each of these prompts. I think that the main cause is this thing. And right now we're just talking one sentence each because this is my introductory paragraph. In fact, I'll leave myself a note saying intro paragraph. All right, now an important thing to know is how long you're supposed to be writing this. So this says 1900 to 2000 words. How long is that? Well, I can tell you that a double-spaced page in Times New Roman font with 1-inch margins, like you'll have if you use our template, one full page of text will be around 250 words. So a little math tells us that we're talking 7 to 8 pages here. 7 to 8 pages. If you think around 3 paragraphs, 2 to 3 paragraphs per page, we are talking somewhere around 22 to 25 paragraphs. Not huge page-long paragraphs, but 22 to 25. Some might be longer, some might be shorter, but that's in round terms. So when you think about these things in the outline, say, oh, well, there is actually the room for me down in the body of the paper to have a whole paragraph expanding on this and a whole paragraph expanding on this. So I can go in here and say, okay, I'm going to be listing my main point. And so on and so forth. Let's say we're starting with 5. And you want to discuss things in the same order that you have below. And why do I starting out with 5? Well, I saw here's this conflict survey results. So we want to have that in addition to the other things. And we see there's a reflection on that. Okay, so there's probably going to be another one. And so you can use this as a model for building your outline. And if you go through, we don't need this because we'll get this on the paper. These are reminders that won't be part of our outline themselves. If we go through in this fashion, just adding and all these things together and making notes on it, pretty soon we'll have something that's going to be around 15, 20 paragraphs, notes. And then if we think, okay, well, we're going to have 1 or 2 paragraphs for introduction and probably a couple paragraphs at the end for reflection, that's actually all we need. So the assignment instructions turn out to give you a whole basis for charting out your paper. Now, the exact details and some of the ordering things, those will vary. But if you're looking for what do I write here, this is all the prompts you need. Let's go back to those slides. Now, I do recommend that you read the assignment before you do the course reading for the week. Because if you read the assignment and start just in the copy and pasting the outline into the template, as you do the reading, you will see things that you're like, oh, well, I can talk about this here. Or I can use that as some of that evidence they said to get about what so-and-so said on this topic. So these are just slides for your review that cover what we're talking about. Do make sure that you check to make sure you haven't missed any of these. And the easiest way to do that is start from just copy and paste it all over. All right, now you'll also see that at the bottom of each assignment page that there is a grading rubric that says, essentially, here is what your instructor will be allocating for points for each section. This is another way that you can check your outline to make sure it has everything. Do you have an introduction? Yes. Do you give your personal definition of conflict? Yes, check. Do you discuss your J. Hall score results? Yes, check. So on and so forth. This next slide is going to be looking at a similar assignment from the EDD program from Leadership 714. And I think I recall correctly that we have a couple people from EDD in this. So this should be coming up, I believe, this weekend. So this assignment is one where often people overthink it because you see the instructions say, write a 3 to 5 page paper. So that's 3 to 5 pages of text content, not your cover page, not your references. That's 3 to 5 of the text. So we're talking maximum around 1,250 words. I've seen people write these long narrative things and come in with 10 pages and say, how do I cut this down? And my answer is always, oh, let's go look at the rubric and see what they actually want you to reflect on, what questions they want you to answer, because those are the things that you need to cover. Going back to that Venn diagram that we started with earlier, when you come in with a lot more than is required, rather than being just that triangle that's in the middle, here we are, you want to be in this central little triangle here. But usually when you just start writing and writing and writing, you end up with this big eye circle. And again, we want that intersection of where your experience and the text that you're reading and the larger world that you're trying to solve problems and to become professionally competent in addressing. And we want to be in this central little triangle. All right, back to where we were earlier. And again, I do encourage you to pose questions as we go along, because I know this material pretty well, but I don't know how much you personally want and would benefit from repeating some of this or going over it in a different way. So if you feel like you would benefit from any of that, please just let me know and I'm happy to spend more time on a particular aspect. All right, so this next one here, you'll see that is part of the criteria for this assignment. We have a simpler rubric in the sense that there are fewer things laid out. But note the words that start this. The paper is being specifically graded on its synthesis and its analysis. Now, I'll tell you, we have a whole hour-long webinar that we do on synthesis and analysis. And you can wait till that comes up later in this term, or if you're interested right now, if you go to the Writing Center website on our webinar page, just scroll down and you'll find the last times we offered this and a link to watch the video of that. All of our webinars are recorded, included this one. We'll be posting the link later today. So we'll see that about 40% of the grade goes to how well you have combined the information from the course readings and use that information there to demonstrate that you understand the current research on these topics. And the synthesis is when you create a new meaning from what you have. So definitely think of, okay, how is this applying to the larger things that I'm trying to do? Which ones to talk about? Well, you can see here it says, apply the knowledge you've gained about yourself. So we have these clues here. Okay, the end goal is, how are you going to become better at setting and meeting goals? So definitely talk about that. In the analysis portion, which, don't be led astray by the fact that it's the same number of points as the synthesis, we've got a whole list of things here that we need to cover in the analysis section. So focused on long-term goals and the short-term goals that get you. Make sure that you answer these questions. You start with your outline, and then with the paragraphs you write, start in the order that is presented here, because that's the order your instructor will be looking for these things when they have the rubric in hand and grading you. But again, if we just start with copy and pasting this into the template, pretty soon you'll find that you have just as many paragraphs spelled out in the outline as you need to write a 3 to 5 page paper here. Outlining. Outlining, I will say that a lot of people agree that outlines are great. Many fewer people will actually follow through and use the outline or create an outline. And I will say that it's an important thing to do, because the longer your papers get, the harder it will be to make sure that you are doing exactly what you need to do and no more. No more, no less. You want to write the 3 to 5 page paper that's required for this, or the 8 to 10 that's required for that other one, and not write pages that you just have to cut because it's not actually required or of interest to the instructor. So start with that outline. Use the fact that you are copy and pasting the assignment instructions to make sure you put in an answer to each of those questions using the wording there. And as you put information to your outline, whether it's just a note or a placeholder or a full-on sentence, make sure you put in your citations as you write. It takes a whole lot more time to go and read through your reading and find out exactly where that information came from than to just put it in your outline in the first place as you go along. And here are just some examples of how that might go. And here's an example of how you might start filling out this with example quotations and crib notes and examples that you want to discuss. I'm going to talk about section A here, just because I find that some of these examples are very interesting to me in my experience. So in this particular outline, the writer has said, oh, I think that the chief cause is perception. And it's not just my opinion. I am citing Hawker and Wilmot in support. Now, whether they end up using that quote or whether they paraphrase or summarize it, you still want a citation there. And when the instructions say a demonstrated understanding of the research, you're using that citations as part of how you do that. A lot of people think, oh, demonstrate my understanding, I need to write this whole massive thing. No, make a direct, clear statement, and then tell us how you know that by having the author date citation. That's all you need. All right, so cause of personal conflict, they wrote in a note to themselves, my definition relates to cultural identity. And then they gave Hawker and Wilmot's definition, which they could say, oh, I agree with Hawker and Wilmot's definition, or they could say, I do not agree with that. So it's not just a matter of plopping the quote in there. Tell us how you think. What does this relate to your own ideas and identity? My favorite part here is when it talks about decision-making or conflict in cultural identity. Now, cultures are many different things. It's not just someone from a different country. It can be a different culture here in the United States. My father is from California. My mother is from Hawaii. I was born in Boston. People from Boston think Californians are crazy and drive too fast, and they're way too laid back. People in California think that people in Hawaii are way too laid back, even by their standards, and drive really too slow. And there are lots of reasons why people believe that you can expand depending on what's important to you. In this case, the reader has selected choosing a spouse from a different culture, going against an original cultural identity. Well, I would say that when my parents met, one of the things that they had as common cultural bridge between them, they're both avid readers, loved learning, loved solving problems, and my grandparents did business together. So there's that connection to bridge the gap that comes from growing up in different parts of the country where things function quite differently. Having learned to drive in Oregon, I think California drivers are crazy. And my parents agree on that. So we've got some common culture there. All right. There are more things we could do with this, but we're going to move on because we've got a lot of slides and resources I want you to know about so that you can revisit this later. When you are doing the readings, again, look at your outline and see, is this something that would answer one of these prompts or that would answer the need to include supporting evidence, in which case, put a note in there. If you're so lucky that when you finish doing your reading, you've got more notes than you need, you say have 10 points for one paragraph, you can look at it and see, okay, what are the best ones? Or what are the ones that most clearly and directly answer this need? And then the other ones, can I move them somewhere else where they will also be helpful there? Or maybe just cut them. By the way, I do recommend using the crossout tool instead of just deleting it immediately, because you might find you want it later, and crossout can visually gloss over, but it's easier than having to go find an old copy of your file. Drafting, this is really how you go from that outline into a complete paragraph. And when you're looking at that paragraph, I recommend using something that I developed called the No Tears Plan. You'll see references on the Writing Center website and other places to the meal plan. The meal plan is a fine thing. It breaks down paragraphs into 4 different components. There's the main idea, the evidence, analysis, and the lead out. It's a good way to start thinking about it. But as you progress through your program, you'll be expected to write more complex arguments, which will require specific things, including a synthesis, that are not necessarily discussed in the meal plan, because the meal plan was actually developed for undergraduate writers at Vanderbilt University. So it's a good starting point, but as you go into the program, just be aware that more is expected than just the elements that the meal plan covers. There's a resource you can look at that here, and I included the key points here. So the No Tears plan specifies that you should make sure you have a topic sentence to start the paragraph. This is usually making a claim that you're going to support with the rest of the paragraph. Give us evidence to support that topic sentence. Analysis, where you look at the evidence and say, okay, well, what does this mean? And is this similar or different? Does this show a particular thing? We'll need usually more than one round of evidence and analysis, so repeat as necessary. And the synthesis is when you take this together and say, okay, here's a larger meaning that comes out of it that is important to what we are trying to do. So if we look at this outline here, in your opinion, how should people of faith view conflict? Support your response with scripture, course material, or outside academic sources. So that's a call for evidence. That scripture, the course material, or outside sources, that's evidence. But at some point you need to discuss, well, how do these relate to each other? Does scripture agree with the reading that was assigned? Does it have a conflict with it or seem to directly disagree? That's your analysis when you point out, well, this actually is in alignment or this isn't in alignment with that. And sometimes there'll be well, this isn't in alignment, but this was actually done differently, so this isn't an apples to apples comparison. And when you put it together, say, okay, so because of these things, I believe X, or these things make me confident in my belief about how people of faith should view conflict. That's your synthesis where you're creating the new meaning. And the new meaning in the reflection paper could be, and here's how I understand that my own self is grounded by these things that I've discussed. So going from that main idea into paragraphs, of course, you want to make sure that you're answering the prompt. The best way to do that is to use the language of the prompt. We're going to do a screen sharing swap here and go back to the web browser to look at those assignment instructions. So the easiest way to make sure that you are responding to these questions or prompts is to answer it using the wording of the question. So if the prompt is, like this one, what were your scores for the 5 conflict modes for each survey? You can certainly respond with something to the effect of, my scores for the 5 conflict modes were score number 1, score number 2, score number 3, score number 4. Now you'll want to discuss those, which is the next set of prompts here. But if you've said, oh, my scores for the Hawker and Wilmot were this, and my scores for the J Hall instrument were that, then when your instructor goes through and says, yes, they did do that, check. And that is a goal just as much in writing your reflection paper as it is when you're a nurse on the ward and you want to make sure that the next person coming in says, okay, I checked their blood pressure, I checked their heart rate, I checked these other things that we have to do. They reported their pain as X. Do the things that are required, and that will get us most of the way there. Developing the main ideas. So it's not just a matter of saying it and moving on. We have to have that discussion, the analysis and synthesis I was talking about. And that clear focus, or creating a good flow between this, is where you make sure that the reader is guided through how these connect. If you come to our Introduction to Graduate Writing webinar this Saturday, you'll hear me talking about this in more detail. But in short, if you're giving an example, give the reader what's called a logical bridge, like the words, for example, comma. So at the start of the sentence, they know, oh, this is an example to support that claim that they made. For example, if your topic sentence said, I think that there is no conflict between scripture and this reading. For example, this passage says blah. Ezekiel 4:22-25 says blah. Although the wording is different, these are very much in agreement. So to me, there is no conflict. Great, we just covered those. And you want to also introduce the sources that you mentioned, because just because you quoted something doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with it. So make sure you introduce and discuss those quotes, and that's how you get smooth source integration. There are a couple examples here to illustrate the things that we're talking about here. And we actually discussed this part already, so I'm going to move on. Just be aware there is this detailed example here. I believe you can find the paper that these examples are drawn from on our website in the sample papers area. So we're going to finish our main discussion here, just talking about a couple things that sometimes get people tripped up. If you who are in this webinar today are anything like our past cohorts of students, we have people from a variety of ages and who are taking classes with professors at a variety of ages. Sometimes something happens that is rather like when the New Testament comes out and you're Jewish and you say, wait a minute, we can eat pork now? Because you've grown up and the Old Testament is very firm on that do not eat pork bit. But in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, we have that debate between Peter and Paul that ends up with their deciding, well, yes, new law, you can do this. You are not required to follow the same old dietary guidelines as before. So similarly, when APA went from 5th edition, which said, do not use I under any circumstances, essentially, to 6th edition saying, oh, okay, so if you're clarifying who did what, I makes a whole lot more sense than saying, oh yes, that handsome fellow with a PhD in music and English who looks a lot like me, but I'm not going to tell you who is B, did this thing. Yeah, it's just so much easier and faster to say, I did that. So you are not only encouraged to use I when it clarifies who did what. In a reflective writing paper, you absolutely want to be using I to show who you're talking about. Don't use a global we or you or us or generic. People believe that. No, the reflection is about what you yourself believe and how you understand your relation to the larger world or to a specific problem. There are ways that we talk about in our Introduction to Graduate Writing webinar and in our dedicated APA webinar about how you can avoid overusing I. Short version, if you clarify at the beginning of the paragraph in the first sentence that you're talking about you, then you can use passive voice, this thing was done for the other sentences because we know that you were referring to you at that point. We have a couple sample paragraphs as here. I'm going to gloss over those because you can look over them later, and I would like to make sure that we leave time for questions. But look at this one, where the prompt is, reflect on your personal definition of conflict. And this starts out, my personal definition of conflict parallels Hawker and Wilmot's definition as blah. So this is a nice direct response where it clarifies whose perspective you're giving, my personal definition, and that's using the language from the prompt, personal definition of conflict, so the reader knows you are answering it directly. I often see something where it's the equivalent of a good way of understanding conflict is, and in some styles of writing, you might do that because you're trying to explain a complex issue in different terms. Not so in APA. In APA, you want to use consistent words to refer to the same thing so that there's no confusion about this being the same thing. So if it says your personal definition, then responding my personal definition is exactly what you should be doing. I do want to call attention to something that is in this particular set of examples on this slide and the next one. The third sentence says, Hawker and Wilmot define interpersonal conflict. Now, in general, in writing in APA style, you want to use past tense to refer to things said and done in the past. Hawker and Wilmot's article was published in 2018, so you would say, Hawker and Wilmot defined interpersonal conflict. Usually in the first couple of reflection papers, the faculty aren't terribly particular about whether you're using present tense or past tense. But do be aware that as you progress through your program, increasingly they will require you to use past tense to refer to, again, things said and done in the past. So I just want you to be aware of that. And this is true of all of our programs. The standard of writing and formatting expectations, your knowledge of APSL is expected to grow over time. So I say, might as well start working on that now. Just use past tense consistently. When you say, they found this, they said this, they argued that, all past tense. Now, if you're describing an ongoing phenomenon, like birds fly south for the winter, then parentheses, Hawker and Wilmot, 2018. Sure, that's fine, because you're describing an ongoing phenomenon. But if you're talking about it being found or stated or argued, etc., again, past tense. If you are talking about yourself, you can use I believe to say something that you have now. So be careful not to use I believed, because that makes it sound like you don't believe that anymore. So be particular about what messages you're sending with that use of text. We've got a couple more illustrative examples there, but I want to bring this to a pause now and ask, are there any items that you would like me to talk about in greater detail? Was everyone able to grab a copy of the APA course paper template? Is there anything else like that that you'd like me to cover in the remaining time that we have? These last couple slides here are going over things that we've already talked about, ways to navigate the not writing something that doesn't really tell the reader anything new. If it's information that they will get from the title of the paper, you probably don't need to put that into the topic sentence or the opening paragraph. Any questions? Concerns? All right. Well, I'm going to pass over this to just describe a couple more things before we wrap up, and say that a good way of exploring this kind of material is to start from the perspective of what do you need to do and what's the most efficient way to do that. Now, if you know yourself and say, I need to go over the reading a couple times, then maybe you don't want to do your outline right away on that first read. Maybe you want to read it once, then look at the assignment, and then start creating your outline. You can also do what's called a reverse outline, where you go through and you make an outline from the paper or the draft that you've written, and then you check that against the assignment instructions. A reverse outline is a good mechanism for revision and editing, but I would say it works best when you've started with the outline to begin with, because that will save you time in the end. So we had a question about outlining technique. And so I'm going to switch back to sharing that Microsoft Word document. So if you are showing larger sections, it's a good idea to illustrate that in a way that you understand. So this basic hierarchy here is starting out with, okay, each of these larger bullets, the ones furthest to the left, is a paragraph. Now, nothing stops you from going ahead and saying, all right, well, it's going to take me a couple paragraphs to do this. So you can go ahead and say, well, this is going to be 2 to 3 paragraphs. So I'm going to say 3 paragraphs, and I'm going to select all of this stuff here. And then I'm going to take the indent tool up here and bump everything in. So I have a note to myself saying, all right, ultimately I'm going to have 3 paragraphs here. And so that's a good way to see, okay, so functionally, this is going to be a subsection by itself. And the key there is to label, so you know that's what it's talking about. Introductory paragraphs and conclusions. Are there other pieces of advice I might give? Yeah, I talked about this earlier, but make sure that the conclusion is not just a summary of what you said before. The reader should know the larger part of what you said. What you want to do is remind them so that when you get to your talking about how or why this is important, you're doing it from the point of, okay, so these are the key points, and these are important these ways. It's a way of collecting the reader's attention. Just like when you get your bill at the restaurant, the receipt that has the breakdown of things, it's like, oh yeah, I got this dish that was really expensive, or you got those drinks. And so if you have that reminder, it's easier to have that discussion of how you're splitting the bill versus you just get the total and people's like, well, how much was my thing? I don't know. So unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today, but I encourage you to come to our other webinars. And there is one more private question about culinary matters that I will respond to privately. So if that was you, don't leave the room yet, but we are now done with our main presentation. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you come to our Intro to Graduate Writing on Saturday at 12. Have a good day, everyone.